All right, well, welcome so much to this program sponsored by the J. Lewis Crozer Library in Chester, Pennsylvania. We're down in the southeast corner of the state, just south of Philadelphia, about 10 minutes from the Philadelphia airport. If you've ever flown out of Philly, you probably flew right over the library as you were headed off somewhere exciting. So on behalf of our director, Dr. Mark Winston, I'm Susan Waller, the head of programming, and we are pleased to have with us tonight Charles Fergus. He is a Pennsylvania native. He's the author of 17 nonfiction books, including Make a Home for Wildlife and Trees of Pennsylvania and the Northeast. He's recently released the second in a mystery series set in the 1830s central Pennsylvania, featuring Pennsylvania Dutch sheriff named Gideon Stoltz. The first book in the series, A Stranger Here Below, garnered significant acclaim, with Pulitzer Prize winning author Geraldine Brooks noting that the book was deeply imagined and intricately plotted historical fiction with the urgency of a mystery novel. Nighthawk's Wing, the second book in the series, which I just finished reading this weekend, was just released last month and received a prestigious starred review from Publishers Weekly. You can learn more about Charles and his books at his website, which is charlesfergus.com. And he also just started a newsletter, and you're able to sign up for the newsletter there at his website. Charles, as I said, was born and raised in central Pennsylvania, but he now lives, as we've been hearing, in Vermont, along with that maple sugar, in the Northeast Kingdom with his wife, Nancy Marie Brown, and 4 Icelandic horses. He likes to read books of all kinds, especially historical fiction and mysteries with compelling plots and believable characters. But in his experience, few mystery writers convey the real truth of murder. And I'm going to let Charles relate how he draws on his own experiences in the Gideon Stoltz series. And we have some questions that we've agreed upon. So we're going to do kind of a quasi-interview format here tonight, and then we will open things up. So if you have some questions that you'd like to ask, you'll have the opportunity to do that as well. But I wanted to start with a question that will connect nonfiction writing with fiction writing, since you've done so much of nonfiction and now are I think in the fiction track of things. How did you choose the setting for this mystery series? And is there a connection between the research and writing you've done for all of your nature and outdoors writing and your choice of Adamant and the surrounding areas as the setting for Gideon Stoltz's investigations?
Well, it was pretty easy to choose my setting because it's modeled on the part of Pennsylvania where I grew up, where I was born and raised, where I spent many, many hours out in the field, out in the outdoors, in the woods, botanizing, hiking, riding horses, backpacking, and I really have the Ridge and Valley region of central Pennsylvania firmly in my blood. I love it up here in Vermont, and my wife and I have been here now for almost 20 years, but I still go back to central Pennsylvania periodically, and you know, I just have to go back every so often and kind of soak up the ambiance and wander around in the woods and find, you know, I particularly like going to areas of old growth timber that would look now, even now, quite a bit like what they would have looked like in the 1830s when my fictional character Gideon Stoltz was sheriff of my imagined Coleraine County in the central part of the state. And Susan, you asked about the relationship between the nonfiction work I've done, the books that I've written, and the Gideon Stoltz mysteries. And the way I would link them is that when I write fiction, I try to present concrete details about places and about people and about situations. And so if I want to set a scene, I'm reporting, you know, there's a universe of observations one could make about any scene, but I want to report concrete observations because I feel that if the reader simply hears these observations, these details, then they will form the kind of a picture that I want them to convey the fiction and the story. And so knowing about the place of central Pennsylvania, knowing about the nature, the wildlife, the trees, and of course they're different now, they're different when I was growing up than they were in the 1830s, but there are a lot of similarities as well. But knowing those things gives me confidence to write scenes that I think are believable. So I would say that all of the research that I've done for the nonfiction books, trees of Pennsylvania, natural areas of Pennsylvania. I wrote a book about mushrooms, wildlife. I can then draw on that information in creating the scenes that I think give a special verisimilitude to my fiction.
Speaking about that research, the next question that I had was really if you would compare, I read Swamp Screamer and then some parts of the Trees book, and obviously lots and lots of research, secondary source research, but for Swamp Screamer, you were clearly there on the ground in the mud and really doing a lot of hands-on research. So could you compare that kind of research with the research that you did for the Gideon Stoltz novels?
Swamp Screamer is a book about the Florida panther, an endangered species or subspecies actually of cougar or puma that lives in Florida. And to write that book, I did a lot of research by reading scientific papers, by interviewing people, but I also did spend a lot of time out in Florida in the swamps. And so, I guess I would relate that closely to spending time out in Pennsylvania. And honestly, when you write nonfiction, narrative nonfiction of that sort, it's not dissimilar to writing fiction, because you are looking at all the details, all the things that may be happening around you, whether it's bird calls or the slant of the light or the vegetation, and you're reporting on those aspects of your environment to try to paint a picture for the reader. And so I really do the same thing with the fiction. I imagine a scene in Pennsylvania, and then I try to deliver to the reader the kinds of observations that will put them into that scene and that will allow them to enter the fictional dream that I'm working to create.
What were some of the sources that you read in terms of what life was like and how people dressed and how they spoke, and some of those character development and setting from the time period? Where'd you do your investigating reporting for all of that kind of detail in the novels?
Well, if I didn't have a fixed camera, I would turn it over and point it toward a shelf of books that is in the opposite side of my room. But yes, I read widely, everything from accounts of taverns in Pennsylvania. There's a great book about taverns in the southeastern part of Pennsylvania, to books about Pennsylvania Germans. The second novel in the series features a valley in central Pennsylvania that has been settled largely by people coming in from southeastern Pennsylvania. So I did a lot of reading about the Pennsylvania Germans, about witchcraft, folk beliefs, burial customs, the technology of making iron. Could I ask everybody to mute their phone, please, or mute their microphone, because there's some pretty loud background noise working its way in here that's distracting.
I think it might actually be my laptop, which the fan is. So I will mute, and then while you answer the questions, and I'll unmute to ask you. I've got a noisy fan for some reason.
That sounds good. But I think maybe I've answered your question. I guess the one thing I would say too is that as a writer, you have to be careful not to do too much research. And that may sound strange, but have you ever sat down with a book of nonfiction and all of a sudden you wondered, or excuse me, a book of fiction, a novel, a historical novel, and all of a sudden you wondered, am I reading fiction or am I reading nonfiction? Because, you know, details and facts are piled one on top of the other. And that there is a great temptation to do that. But when you're writing a piece of fiction, a mystery, whether it's a mystery or whether it's a different genre within fiction, you can't let the history or the facts bog down the story. Everything has to be in service to the story. So I do a lot of research, but then at a certain point, I pretty much put the research away and I rely on what I remember. I can certainly go back to sources and check in on them if I need to, you know, determine whether how an iron furnace works or whatever it may be. But I think it makes sense to really, well, I think it's a necessity to allow the story to rule and the profluence of the story to be the dominant aspect of the piece of writing.
I think maybe while we're on the subject of research, one of the things I've noticed and enjoyed as a musician is the references to the shape singing and the choir rehearsals, and then your couplet that starts from a hymn, your couplet that starts each chapter. So could you talk a little bit about that? And is that part of your background and upbringing, and how did that work its way into the novels?
Well, in the first, I've written 2 Gideon Stoltz mysteries, and the first one is titled A Stranger Here Below. And that's actually a line from a shape note hymn. Shape note is a type of hymn singing, hymn composing, and hymn singing that was very prominent in the 1800s. And it still is today in some parts of the country. It's a tradition that has been lost in large part from our culture, although it has hung on mostly in the American South, but actually all over the country, and it's enjoying something of a resurgence. The couplets that begin each chapter tend to have, they're drawn from different shape note hymns, and they tend to have a relevance to the material that's going to follow within that chapter. And the title of Stranger Here Below comes from a couplet, I am a stranger here below, and what I am is hard to know. And it's a line from a shape note, from the poetry in a shape note hymn. I do sing shape note myself. I haven't for a little over a year because of the pandemic. I also sing in a folk trio. We're called Yestermorn. And so just the 3 of us, it's all a cappella. Shape note is a cappella too. And then I also sing in a hospice chorus, also a cappella, in which we practice weekly, and then we go to folks who are in hospice care who want to hear the human voice, want to hear music, and we go and we sing. We have over 100 songs in our repertoire. But yeah, originally I had envisioned this series to have a shape note title, shape note related title for every mystery. And I can't even remember now what the second one was supposed to be, but I sent it into the manuscript to my editor, and they thought, we don't really like this title that much. So they said, can you choose a title that has something to do with nighthawks? Because nighthawks, the birds, are a major theme within the story. And so that's how we came up with Nighthawk's Wing.
So I wondered if you also would talk to us a little bit about writing a series. I don't know about the other folks who are on our Zoom tonight, but I love series and mystery series, especially. I have to admit, I read tons of British mysteries, but I like a series because I got another book to read when I'm done. I get really invested in the characters and enjoy spending time with them and want to spend time. And so even when people are writing pastiches, I still, ooh, it's that character. I want to read some more. I was a children's school librarian for quite a while, and kids love series as well because there's going to be another book to read. So I wonder if you talk a little bit about writing a series, how much is planned, how much is organic? Do you really know the whole arch? I know some things I read about J.K. Rowling in the Harry Potter. She really knew where it was in. She had some pieces of the end even as she began and knew kind of big picture where she was headed. So I'm wondering about this series and how much you've already planned out and how much happens as you write.
When I wrote the first mystery, A Stranger Here Below, I really kind of wrote it as a lark. I wasn't thinking about a series per se. I just wanted to see if I could write a mystery. And it took me quite a while. And it took me a lot of work. In fact, one of the folks who is in the audience here, Garrett Nelson, a friend of mine, he's also a friend of Mark Winston, the library director. Garrett lives here in Vermont, and he will remember reading an early draft of this mystery, and probably he would tell you that it changed a great deal because of input from him, from actually a bunch of different folks who read the book. So I didn't really, initially I didn't really have a series in mind, but as I wrote A Stranger Here Below and thought about these characters who I had created, I developed a real liking for them, and I wanted to stay with them. So I then thought, well, from a purely strategic standpoint as a writer, exactly what you said, Susan, and that is that mysteries are very popular. Series are very popular. And so I felt that a good way to make, to up the odds of being able to publish additional novels, mysteries, would be to have a series and to follow characters through a longer arc than just one mystery. And you asked if I had the full arc of the character in my mind. I would have to say no, because sometimes characters do things that surprise you. Characters change in ways that you might not have predicted if you had outlined a novel, an entire mystery beforehand. And the way that I work kind of gives characters this freedom to develop in much the same way that people develop as they age, as they encounter different life situations. What I do is, when I write a mystery, and this is especially true for the second one, it's how I work for the second one, and it is how I am working currently on the third mystery, which is in progress. But what I do is I write a journal entry in the character and the voice of the different characters. So it's first person. I write this first person account of what life is like for this person, this one character, what they want out of life, what their desires are, what their fears are, what their backstory is, their past, what it was like for them as a child. And some of these are long. I mean, I would say the one that I wrote for the villain in Nighthawk's Wing, and we will not reveal who she or he is, but the villain's personal story is about, I'd say maybe 12, 15 pages long. So having created these characters in my mind and having given them life, then when they get together, they do things that I'm not always expecting to happen. And so, while I do have the arc of the entire story in my mind in a very general way, I also allow for the serendipity of things happening as two different characters who I know very well interact. I often know what the ending of each of a mystery will be in the novel, and I've only finished two and had and I'm in the process of writing the third, and I'm pretty close to finishing a manuscript on the third. But my experience so far has been that I know what the ending will be, and then I gradually work toward that ending with these characters that I know. I don't know if I've answered your question completely, or if you have other aspects of it that you want to ask about.
No, I think that that answers my question. And you, in your bio, you talk about liking to read mysteries. So I wonder if you could tell us who some of your favorite mystery writers are, series, and how they may have influenced what you have done in these two mysteries that you've written so far.
Well, usually when somebody asks me that question, I get a total brain cramp. And I think about, oh yeah, let's see. I read, oh no, what was its title? And I can't even remember the author's name. But anyway, I've actually taken the precaution of writing down a small list here so that I can look at it and I can tell you what some of my favorite books are, some of the mystery writers who I really like. I think that the first or perhaps best historical mystery that I have read in recent memory is The Alienist by Caleb Carr. And that's set around the turn of the 20th century in New York City, but it's an excellent historical mystery. And when I read that, I thought, I like to read historical fiction, but then I thought having a mystery that is also historical kind of brings an extra dimension to the story. So The Alienist by Caleb Carr, a very fine novel. Among other mystery writers who I like would be James Lee Burke. I like his mysteries a great deal, and I can see Garrett up in that small screen nodding, because Garrett and I both enjoy James Lee Burke's mysteries. There's an Icelandic mystery writer named Arnaldur Indriðason, and my wife and I have a special affinity for Iceland, and we've been there a number of times. I've probably been there a dozen times. She's probably been there 25 times or more. But Arnaldur Indriðason has a series with the same inspector. His name is Erlendur. So this is an Inspector Erlendur series, and I would highly recommend his books because they're contemporary, but they give you a very interesting picture of a different part of the world. Lately, I've been reading a lot of Michael Connelly's mysteries, and his main character, who I like a great deal, is the improbably named Hieronymus Bosch, who is a detective in Los Angeles, and he goes by the name of Harry Bosch. So I think he's a great character. I like the Norwegian writer, Karen Fossum. I don't know if you know her, but she has quite a nice series. Walter Mosley's mysteries set in post-World War II Los Angeles. His Easy Rawlins main character is a great character. I recently read a very interesting novel set at the same time, mysteries set at the same time as my Gideon Stoltz mysteries are set, but in Turkey. And this is the Inspector Yashim series by Jason Goodwin. Very good and full of really interesting details about Istanbul, and also particularly about cooking. And his main character is not really a formal detective, but he's a eunuch. So a very different kind of a character. I like Peter Robinson's DSI, Alan Banks series set in London. So those are some of the ones. And I also love historicals that are not mysteries. Paulette Giles is a writer who I like a great deal. Stories, novels set in the American West, particularly in Texas, after the Civil War. I think Patrick O'Brien's Aubrey Maturin seafaring novels are probably the finest historical fiction that I've ever read. So that's kind of a partial list. I could go on, but might get a little boring.
Well, maybe you'll relate your Anne Perry story, and that will lead us to the question about the relationship between Gideon and True. And I think you can talk a little bit about having that male and female. I think about some great couples, whether it's Lord Peter and Harriet Vane, or whether it's Charlotte and Thomas Pitt from her novels, or a number of couples who are kind of detecting in tandem. You could tell us that story about Anne Perry, and then how that has influenced what you are doing, and maybe even where you see this series going a little bit.
It's a great question, and I look forward to answering it. When I had written A Stranger Here Below and had it in a shape where I thought it made a good mystery, I went to a writing conference in Florida. And this was a conference of the Historical Novel Society, HNS. It's a neat group. They have they actually started in Britain, and they alternate year to year. They'll have a conference one year in Britain, next year in North America, and back and forth. But this one was in Florida, and at the time I didn't even actually have an agent, because my agent for some of my nonfiction books had died. So I was looking for an agent, and you can have sit-down sessions with agents at conferences such as this. But one of the speakers at the conference, she wasn't the keynote, but she was a major speaker. One of the earlier evenings was Anne Perry. And I knew her Victorian era Charlotte and Thomas Pitt's mysteries. Anyway, she spoke about that and writing mysteries, historical mysteries, hers set in the Victorian era in London. The morning after she spoke, I went into the dining room, and almost no one was there, but I noticed that she was there. And so I, got my coffee and my croissant and walked over to the table, and I said, "Would you like some company?" And she said, "Oh, I'd love some company." So we had a nice conversation, and by and by she asked me about whether I was a writer and what I was working on, and I told her about A Stranger Here Below. And so she had a very interesting and I think perceptive suggestion, and that was to, in subsequent novels, develop my main character's wife as a major character, because she had found that having both a man's and a woman's point of view in a mystery really enriched the story by opening up, complementing perspectives on the part of, a man may see something completely different than a woman, and vice versa. And so I followed her advice in writing Nighthawk's Wing. And I found that True's, this is Gideon's wife, her name is True Stoltz. Her emergence as a strong, independent character has made writing these mysteries a lot more enjoyable to me, and a lot more satisfying. Just a little bit about True. She is in her early 20s. Gideon is also in his early 20s. And she is a strong woman who comes out of the Scotch-Irish culture. And these were the folks who originally settled my fictional Coleraine County. And it's also similar to what happened in the central part of the state where I grew up. The first wave of settlers were mostly Scots-Irish. And then later, a lot of Germans came in. So Gideon is German and True is Scots-Irish. So there's a little bit of a cultural I don't know, disconnect there, I guess you could say. But they're in love, and as the series goes on, I anticipate that True will play a much more major role, and I think Susan, you'd probably agree that she plays a very significant role in Nighthawk's Wing.
One of the things in your bio at your website, you say that in your experience, few mystery writers convey the real truth of murder. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that statement and talk to us a little bit about what you think they miss and what you think you've been able to put into your books in order to convey that real truth.
Well, the fact of the matter is that I lost my mother to a murder, and this happened in 1995. So it's been a long while, and you know, a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then. But I had it was a you know, tremendously traumatic experience, and when I read mysteries that downplay the seriousness of murder, I wouldn't say I'm insulted, but I'm a little bothered by that fact, because we tend to trivialize this very destructive, violent, damaging action. This, you know, it's a human behavior. People do these things, but to write about them in a trivializing way, I think is wrong, honestly. So, you know, I watch the Poirot series on PBS. You know, okay, that's what's called a cozy mystery. You know, in cozy mysteries, often the mystery or the murder is, you know, if it's a murder mystery, it's downplayed. It's in some cases, authors of cozy mysteries treat it almost humorously, which I think is a big mistake. We can't be serious all the time, but I do think it's not good to trivialize murder. So what I tried to do with my character Gideon Stoltz, well, actually, the first draft of A Stranger Here Below did not have this aspect of Gideon's character, but a friend of mine who read it at about the same time that Garrett read it, she knew of what had happened in my life, and she said, you should write this book having a main character who has actually been what is called a survivor of murder, which is kind of a, you know, odd term, but it means a person who has been touched by a murder, by losing a family member. She said, knowing what you know about murder, you can write about this honestly in a way that very few people can. And so that's what I tried to do. I decided to make my main character, Gideon Stoltz, have him carry the burden of having lost his own mother to a murder. And in Gideon's case, the murder happened when he was a boy of 10, and he discovered his mother's corpse, his mother's body. And of course, it had a big effect on him, and he has experienced flashbacks in his life. And sometimes when in the case of some of the murders that he needs to investigate, he reflects on what happens, and he thinks about the effects of murder on survivors too. So it's not just, you know, a body there. It's a real person who has been deprived of life and who leaves behind survivors, whether they're that person's family members or friends or members of a community. But murder does have a real effect, and I try to present that honestly in my mysteries.
I think that kind of leads to the last question I have, and then we'll open the floor up for folks if they have some questions or comments they'd like to make. But another, I think, big theme that I'm seeing even more so in the second book than in the first book is faith and loss of faith. And I'm going to test my memory here, but Auden has an essay, I believe it's called Murder in the Vicarage, but that could be an Agatha Christie title too, so I could be completely wrong. But in it, he talks about mysteries and how powerful they are at recognizing the wrong that's in the world and trying to set things right, and even the redemptive nature of mysteries. And so I'm wondering, in terms of your characters, I think both of them in the second book really struggling with what they believe and whether they believe in a higher being. How, if you might talk about that for a few minutes before we open up to hear from other folks if they have questions.
Yeah, I will. And I guess I'd preface what I have to say by noting that people in the 1830s in general were more concerned about God and religion than many of us are today. It was a time, this was during a period of our country's history called the Second Great Awakening. And it was a period of intense religious fervor. People were concerned about their souls. People had a special relationship very often with God. It was a very emotionally intense way of looking at the world and believing in a higher being. And Gideon and True are part of that culture, of course. And in fact, they go to a small Methodist church in Adamant, and they sing shape note hymns, which are inevitably about God and your spirit and what may happen to you when you die. And because, of course, at this time, death was very much all around people, and it happened much more abruptly and surprisingly in many cases than it does today. So, but Gideon and when you create characters, you want them to be legitimate to their time and place. You also want them to be complex people. You want, at least I do, I want them to be folks that we can identify with. And so, having a crisis of faith at this time would have been a big deal. And the other thing that I think you'll find with most good fiction is that the characters are troubled. They have complexities. They have problems. They find themselves in situations that are difficult to get out of. And so I decided that, I would incorporate this aspect of being religious and then having a crisis of faith into both Gideon and True. And in Gideon's case, his crisis of faith probably had its roots in losing his own mother to a murder, because he would ask himself, how could God let this happen to this good person who was my mom? True has a crisis of faith after she loses her and Gideon's child during an influenza epidemic. And that happens in A Stranger Here Below, the first mystery. So that's partly why I brought it into the book, is because I want to have this sort of complexity in these folks' lives, so that you really look at them and you think, they're not stereotypes. They're not just some, construct, but they're real people. I want folks to relate to them as if they were real people, even though they are fictional characters.
I think that juxtaposition with the hymns and the couplets from the hymns at the start of each chapter and really brings it out and makes it poignant, that here, that's what they're singing and that's what's in his head. He talks a number of times, Gideon talks about knowing all of the words to the hymn, but yet coming to this crisis and really struggling. So I think you're right, it does make them very human and believable. So I would like to open the floor up at this point And if you, audience, have some questions or comments that you'd like to ask or share, we are happy to hear from you. And then we'll give Charles the opportunity to make some closing statements.
I would say, mention one other thing too, is if you want me to, I can read a scene or two from Nighthawk's Wing. Would you like me to do that as people think about questions?
I think that sounds like a great idea. Yeah, so let's listen as you read, and then if you have some questions, there'll be a chance to answer.
So could you do me a favor? Or maybe I can do it. Maybe I can just stop my video and then you can just listen to the words. Is that, or do you think it will be more understandable if you can also see me reading? Probably it would, wouldn't it? I'll tell you what, I'll try it. Let's try it without a...
We could close our eyes and listen.
Yeah, close your eyes and listen. That'll work. I'm going to read a passage in which my main character, Sheriff Gideon Stoltz, questions a man called Thaddeus Kirkwood, who is a suspect in the murder of a woman named Rebecca Kreidler. Rebecca's body was found in a sinkhole in Coleraine County, where Gideon is the sheriff. I'm not reading it, I'm telling you, giving you some background here. Kirkwood is a constable in the next county to the south, in a very small backwoods settlement. The place consists of some cabins clustered around a burned out tavern. And Kirkwood tells Gideon that he believes that Rebecca Kreidler, whose murder Gideon is investigating, set fire to the tavern to cover up the crime of stealing cash out of a desk there. So you need to know a couple of things. One is that Maud, who will be referred to in this reading, is Gideon's horse. Also, a boy is referred to in the passage. He led Gideon to Kirkwood, and then he stuck around to see what would happen because he knows what Kirkwood is like. Okay, I'll start reading. Kirkwood clapped his hands together, and the little dog leaped up joyfully. "This here is Mole," Kirkwood said. "My whole dog. My hound runs a fox down a hole. I put Mole in after him. I put my Mole in the hole." Kirkwood laughed, restoring the grin on his face. "He muckles onto the fox and he kills it and drags it out, even if it takes him all day." "I doubt that Rebecca Kreidler stole any money here," Gideon said. "As far as I could tell, she had no money with her when she got to Sinking Valley. She made brooms and sold them to pay for her keep on the farm where she was staying." "That may be so for all we know," Kirkwood said. "If she burned the tavern down," said Gideon, "I suspect she had a reason." The muscles in Kirkwood's neck tightened. "What did you do to her here?" Gideon said. "And did you then return to Sinking Valley last month to teach her a lesson?" "You're talking hogwash. You're miles from home. You say you're a sheriff, but that don't mean a thing to me." "Mr. Kirkwood, I would like you to remember me," Kirkwood said. "I will give you something to remember me by every time you cough or sneeze." He rushed in so fast Gideon barely got his fists up. Kirkwood grabbed Gideon around the chest and drove him backward. The man locked his hands behind Gideon's back and squeezed. Gideon felt the air whoosh out of his lungs. He let go of Maud's reins. He heard a popping sound in the side of his chest. He tried to strike Kirkwood with his fist, but Kirkwood buried his face between Gideon's neck and shoulder and bit down hard. Gideon yelped at the pain, felt himself lifted off the ground. He heard another pop in his chest and yelled again. He tried to gouge Kirkwood's eyes, but couldn't get his thumbs near them. He drove a fist into Kirkwood's ear, to no effect. He heard the dog barking, felt it sink its teeth into his leg. The cabin tipped and slewed past. He saw the boy squatted down watching. He saw Maud throw up her head and dance. The big man squeezed harder. Again, the cabin, the boy, Maud. sticking to the saddlebag. Gideon grabbed at it. His hand got close but not. He felt the dog yank his lower leg from side to side. Pinpoints of light cascaded at the edge of his vision. Maud, the saddlebag, the club. He got his hand on it. As Kirkwood turned with him again, the club came sliding out of the bag. 2 inches of its handle stuck out from the thumb side of Gideon's right fist. With all his might, he rammed the club's butt into Kirkwood's head. Kirkwood let go. Gideon's feet hit the ground. He stumbled, caught his balance, tried to pull air into his lungs. He switched the club around and brought it down hard on the dog, worrying his leg. The dog let go and fell to the dirt, its hind legs kicking. Kirkwood rushed him again. Gideon swung the club low and hard and hit Kirkwood on the side of his leg. A thud and a snap as the knee buckled inward. Kirkwood screamed and fell. Gideon stood with his sides heaving, pain shooting through his ribs. A hot pulsing where Kirkwood had bitten him on the muscle between his shoulder and neck. He felt blood running down his leg beneath his torn pants. Kirkwood sat on the ground, his legs out in front. His left leg bent oddly at the knee. "You killed Mole," he gasped. "You broke my goddamn leg." Gideon took a step forward and raised the club. Kirkwood cried out and shot a hand above his head. Gideon felt a pure hot rage fill his body. In his mind's eye, he saw his Memmy lying on the kitchen floor, the victim of someone like this man. By God, he would club him. He would beat his head to a pulp. He pulled back, caught his breath, then stepped forward and raised the club again. At this point, Kirkwood admits to having done something very cruel and violent to the woman, and I won't read his exact words. But after he speaks, Gideon lowered the club. He shook all over. He prayed to God he hadn't used Rebecca Kreidler as Thaddeus Kirkwood had done, as someone had used his own mother before stabbing her to death. He looked for the boy, but he was nowhere to be seen. The dog lay unmoving in the dirt, its tongue lolling out. "I'm sorry about your dog," Gideon said, "and it looks like I gave you something that will remind you of what you did to that woman every time you take a step."
It is an intense book. It's a good read, but there are some really tense moments. So if you're looking for, I think, a gratifying and powerful book, then you might want to check out, you need to read A Stranger Here Below first before you read the second one. Does anyone have any questions that they'd like to ask?
I see Tina has her hand up.
You can just unmute and ask.
Oh, I was wondering, do you worry much about the language and the dialogue for sounding appropriate to the time?
Absolutely, I do. I have this really great online dictionary that of American terms, and I can go in there and I can actually find out was a word current in 1830, or did it only show up in 1860 after the Civil War? So yeah, I do pay a lot of attention to that. I try to make the dialogue realistic to the time, at least as I see it. I mean, if you read things that folks wrote back then, they're often very stilted and very formal. And in fact, a big chunk of A Stranger Here Below is a diary kept by a judge. And that is in the language of the time as it would have been written, as opposed to being spoken. So yes, the answer to the question is that I do try to avoid anachronisms in speech, as well as in cultural practices, foods, technology, whatever.
Thank you.
Oh, and I should say too, I've got these really anal copy editors who always jump on anything that seems to be at all out of the out of the time period, and they also jump all over me when I use when I write in Central Pennsylvania dialect. So I have to patiently write stat next to their comments, which means ignore them. Telling my own editor to ignore what this copy editor has said, because yes, I do want them to say "youans" instead of "you people," let's say.
Just a quick comment. First of all, thank you for being with us today. I appreciate your discussing character development and how you think about the characters, and it's quite interesting to hear about the journals. One thing I wonder about with those who write fiction is the extent to which you're relating to the character, whether that starts to complicate the writing process. In other words, identifying with the character and maybe defending or protecting the character, for example, whether that becomes tricky in the writing process.
Well, that's a tough question. Let me think about that a moment here. Also, Susan, could you make me smaller? I don't like looking at myself huge right here. Oh, now we got Mark huge. Could you make us so we're all the same size, Susan?
Well, I took the spotlight off of you, so I think you need to change your view from speaker view to gallery view, and then you'll see everybody the same size.
Perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So, Mark, if I remember your question, you're basically asking about the difficulties of identifying with a character, difficulties that may present. And it's interesting because I have read pieces of fiction in which it's clear the author loves the character too much, and I think lets the character get away with things that might not be realistic. And I think that's especially true in biography. Very often you'll get a biographer who is really biased toward, who really, really likes their subject. And so I think cuts them too much slack. It's interesting because after the first mystery, A Stranger Here Below, and by the way, they don't have to be read in sequence, even though Susan seems to think that's the case. I think that Nighthawk's Wing works perfectly well as a standalone. But after A Stranger Here Below came out, I had a reader, and she said, your Gideon Stoltz is too much of a goody two-shoes. He's too good, And my wife also, Nancy Brown, she also said, Gideon is a little bit on the overly self-righteous and good side. So I thought about that when I wrote the second one. And of course, having godlike qualities as an author, I can make my characters do just what I want them to do and think what I want them to think. And so I made Gideon a bit more, let's say he exposes some of his character flaws a bit more in the second novel. And so I guess, I don't know, Mark, if you were here when I told about how I write out first-person biographies of each of my characters before I begin to actually write the novels. And so I think that's a good time in which a writer can explore their characters' psyches and what makes them tick, and make sure that they're realistic rather than some kind of I guess idealized character. Does that answer your question?
It does. As I was formulating the question, I almost hesitated to ask, given your personal experience as it relates to a character that's so vivid, but I was certainly curious on the broader level. So thank you. Yes, very definitely answers my question.
You're welcome.
I have a question. I have not read the books yet. I have A Stranger Here Below out from the library, but I haven't yet started it. But what you just read to us, I can't get that out of my mind. I mean, that was so vivid. I kind of felt like I was being attacked. You know, I could see it kind of through my own head. And I'm thinking, how did you do that? Did you ever have an experience where somebody picked you up and squeezed you so you couldn't breathe and your ribs popped?
No, thank goodness. It kind of harkens, first of all, thank you for saying that, because it tells me that that was a successful scene.
Yeah.
But and it harkens back to something that I said earlier, and that was that there are a universe of stimuli, of things that you can hear, see, feel, perceive in any moment when you write nonfiction or fiction. And so I think the task of the writer is to do their best job of identifying which of those aspects of a scene will, when read by the reader, place the reader fully into the scene.
Yeah.
You know, so you vividly imagine what is happening, and yes, you draw on your own experience in some ways, but I think it's a matter of technique in many cases. How can I pick the right observations and present them to the reader in the right order, and whether those observations are sights or sounds or smells or tactile sensations, but how can I present them in a way that will put the reader right there in the scene?
Yeah.
So that the reader can almost live the scene along with the character.
Well, you did.
Well, I have a scene that I'm just getting ready to write, and it's at the climax of my second or the third mystery. And I'm almost hesitating to approach it because it's going to be a very violent scene. But, you know, I'll use that same approach that I just described and try to create the scene in a way that will be vivid and have the effect that I want it to have.
And then you can turn it off once you're finished with the scene. You can, I mean, you so immersed yourself into it, right? When you're writing it, it must be kind of hard to cut it.
Well, I will admit that sometimes I wake up at night and I dream about my characters. So they are definitely on my mind. And sometimes, and this is really interesting, I wake up in the morning having discovered how I want to present a certain scene. And I don't specifically remember thinking about it, but you know, this has come to me subconsciously, I guess you could say, while I'm sleeping. So no, I don't really have trouble leaving these scenes behind. It doesn't seem like that's a problem for me.
That's good.
And not all of the scenes are violent, of course, but well, you know, it's interesting too, because I saw something on a reader posted something on, I think it might have been Goodreads or something, about how they started this book and were shocked to find out that the amount of violence that it had, and this was in reference to Nighthawk's Wing, and that it included the abuse of a corpse and poisoning and so on. I said, hey, I'm thinking to myself, this is a mystery, right? You know, it's not necessarily going to be a bump-free ride.
Yeah.
So Gideon, Gideon. Garrett, see, I guess Gideon is on my mind.
Yeah.
Garrett, you had a question.
Yeah. First of all, hi Mark, hi Chuck, and everybody else. The issue of reconciling some of the mores that were commonplace in a certain time period, and yet may not be acceptable in this time period. How did you handle that?
That's a really good question. For instance, actually, I wrote an essay for, I can't remember, it was some online magazine, maybe it was somebody's blog, but let me see if I can find it here, because I think it did a good job of answering your question, kind of. Yeah, the question was, were there indispensable people without whom you couldn't have written Nighthawk's Wing? And here's what my answer was. Discussing the novel's plot and subject matter with my wife, the writer Nancy Marie Brown, helped me better understand True, as well as the difficulties that a woman faced in the early 1800s. She couldn't vote. She couldn't own property if she were married. Her husband got it all. He could even sell his wife's clothes if he wanted to. And she was legally subject to corporal punishment if her husband chose to apply it. My main character, Gideon, isn't that kind of man. Nancy helped me explore ways in which he could be different and attractive to modern readers while still remaining believable for his time period. I will say that, yes, it's a challenge. And the third Gideon Stoltz mystery focuses on runaway slaves. Coleraine County, which is modeled on Centre County, where I grew up, is about 80 miles north of the border with Maryland. And in the 1830s, fugitive slaves did, in fact, make their way through Centre County, trying to escape to places farther north. And so, it's a real challenge. How does one get inside the head of a person in the 1830s, an enslaved person, for instance, if you want to write as an omniscient author, which is how I prefer to write? How do you truly get into the head of somebody who's very different from you, who lived in a different time period, in a different place, and in a different situation? So it's a constant challenge, I would say, Garrett, to both create believable characters who are appealing to modern readers, current readers, and yet who also have a relationship to the truth of the era from which they're, where the story is set. Hi, Keith. You can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask me your question.
Yeah. Thanks for taking time to do this presentation. It's very interesting. I actually have two unrelated questions, if that's okay. Is that cheating?
Just ask them one at a time, or I'll forget the first one.
Well, the first is just, I've lived out in the Philadelphia area for about 10 years. I'm originally from Oregon, and I've never gotten out to central Pennsylvania. I think maybe this summer I'd like to do, take my son out there and go camping or whatever. What, if you were to recommend just one or two places to really see for hiking or camping and that kind of thing, where would you recommend?
Oh, wow. What a great question. That's something I'll be just delighted to answer. And I would say, do not miss Allen Seeger Natural Area in Huntingdon County, which is a stand of old growth timber hemlocks, pines, and hardwoods. And it's just a magical place. And if you go on my website, I have a banner photo across the top of the website, and that's actually a picture that I took at Alan Seeger Natural Area.
Cool.
So that'll give you just a taste of it. And of course, you can find lots of pictures of Alan Seeger, but it's got a nice, it's a 250 acre area with a hiking trail through it. And while you're in that same neck of the woods, you can go to, if it's a Wednesday morning, you can go to the Amish auction in Belleville, which is great. You can get your whoopie pies. You can get fueled up on your chocolate whoopie pies, your pumpkin whoopie pies, your maple whoopie pies, whatever you want. You can watch the livestock auction. You can see the horse-drawn buggies. You can talk to the Amish folks because they're friendly. They're probably just as curious about you as you are about them. And also in the vicinity, there's this incredible hawk watching platform on Stone Mountain. So I think if you were to Google hawk watching platform, Stone Mountain, Pennsylvania, you would get you'd be able to find a map and tell you where to park. And if you walk out along that ridge top, it's not a very long hike, maybe like a half mile. You come to this platform made out of wood that projects up above this really rocky, bony ridge top. And you get up on that platform and you can just get a full appreciation for the ridge and valley topography all around you. You can look, to the northeast and the southwest, which is the way those mountain ridges lie. And you can see these ridges trending on for, more than 100 miles. And you can see the fertile farming valleys in between the ridges. But, it's an amazing, I think it's an amazingly overlooked landscape in terms of its beauty. And some of the formations are really dramatic. For instance, in A Stranger Here Below, and I think also in Nighthawk's Wing, I described a feature called the Allegheny Front. And this is where the Ridge and Valley region of Pennsylvania borders the Allegheny Plateau, and it's a height of land. So you have these parallel ridges and valleys to the southeast, and then to the northwest, you have this high, really rugged, but not mountainous plateau. And this geological feature or topographical feature runs all the way from central Pennsylvania down to Georgia. It's the escarpment of the Appalachian, of this large plateau. So I don't know that it's not super distinctive, and I don't know that you'll be able to find it, but it's certainly very interesting.
That's great. Yeah, I actually wrote all that down. You can't see it. But my other question too was I noticed that you've written quite a few books, and I wonder if you've found good techniques before you begin the writing process, if that's even how you go about it, for setting up a like a plan of action. I don't know if maybe you write the outline ahead of time, or you decide you'll write a certain amount of time per day, or do you find anything like that helpful? I think for so many people, the hardest step is the first one.
So I've written several kinds of books. I've written some memoirs. I've written, of course, it's 3 novels now. I've written some narrative nonfiction, which some people at one point were calling literary nonfiction. And that would be a book about the Florida panther and a book about living in an abandoned farmhouse on the coast of Iceland. And then I've written a lot of books that are not how-to. I've written one how-to book too recently, a book called Make a Home for Wildlife, and that's how to create habitat for wildlife. But books like, for instance, Wildlife of Pennsylvania or Trees of Pennsylvania, those have discrete chapters about in the case of the trees book, every species of tree that's found in Pennsylvania. And those sorts of books are much easier to write than narrative nonfiction or novels, because you don't have a story arc to have to follow and to develop. They break down into discrete parts. And what's interesting was that after my mother was murdered in 1995, it was very hard for me to concentrate. It's a symptom of PTSD, of post-traumatic stress disorder, because it was I who found my mother's body, and then I had to testify in the trial of the man who murdered her. So I was pretty well wrecked. And I'm a writer, and at the time I was a freelance writer. I did not have a job to go to, and so I'm wondering, how am I going to get back into the habit of writing and the practice of writing? And my wife, Nancy Marie Brown, she's an excellent writer herself, both of fiction and nonfiction. And Susan, by the way, you should make sure you've got her books in your library, because they're awfully good. Anyway, Nancy said, why don't you do something that you are comfortable with? So that would something to do with nature. And she said, and why don't you do something that you can break down into small, manageable units? And so that's what I did. And it was actually a tremendous solace to be able to turn to writing about trees, to do a whole, 2,000 words on the American chestnut, or on the white oak, or the white pine, just to look at this particular aspect of nature very, very closely, to read resources, to draw on personal experiences, to think about, ways, having, ways that you've heard the wind go through the pine tree or whatever, and then to focus on that and write about it as a unit. So that was really quite helpful to me at that time. And I think they're good books too. And maybe not as challenging as narrative nonfiction, nor as a novel, but still very good books, because I think they get people to look at our natural world more carefully and to appreciate it more as well.
All right, well, I think we're coming to the end of our time. So I want to thank you very much, Charles, for your time and your expertise and your willingness to share your experiences as a writer with us. And I want to thank each of you for coming tonight. We appreciate your support of libraries and your support of reading. And we're grateful that you showed up tonight to our program. We'll finish the recording. It will be up at the library's YouTube channel, and I will be able to email all of you. So I'll send you that link in a few days when this video is processed and up. And thank you again. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening and be safe. Good night.
Thank you very much.
I'd just like to say one more thing.
Sure.
I would like to say I've enjoyed this fully and completely, and that you folks have been great, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary, for making the connection.
Bye.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.